Hello, hope all is well, and today we're going to be looking at this sort of bright light sort of thing, which is the Mooer GS1000li. Now Li stands for, well, lithium edition, I guess, or lithium powered, because as you can see this is on, but there's nothing plugged into this. So the battery lasts maybe something between 5 or 6 hours, depending, at least in my use case scenario when I've been trying this out. And obviously one of the big advantages of having something that's battery powered is that it's completely portable. So you can take this along with you wherever you go and just power it up. There's a headphone out socket, connect to that and just play, mess around to your heart's content. There's also some extra features such as like a groove box, which is like a looper that also has a drum machine attached to that. And there are a few things that, for example, can only be done on the unit itself. So for example, profiling or capturing can only be done on the unit itself using, well, this switch, and then you go through the different menus, but it's super easy to do. And then also, for example, setting up, say, stomp box mode and things like that is only done on the unit itself. But that's fairly straightforward as well. And a huge thanks to Amy from Mooer for getting in touch and asking if I was interested in checking this out, as this is one of the units I was really curious about the kind of capture tech on this and also how it integrates with the different effects. So while I might have been sent the unit, all the opinions and thoughts on this will be my own. And a quick heads up, as you've probably noticed, this is a very long video. So it's quite a deep dive into how to set up and use the unit, setting up tones and things like that. So if you're just interested in various parts, there are timestamps, of course, for you to jump ahead. So this is the device itself. So we have 4 foot switches over here. We have a selector knob here where we can go through presets, select different things and things like that. We have a master volume knob over here. Now, if you probably noticed, the font isn't the easiest to read on this thing. So it's this kind of like dark orange on this black. And we have this kind of lighting going on as well. So underneath we have this lighting, which we can change. However, unfortunately, we can't turn it off, but you can change it to like solid color, so it only stays to the one color. I'd love to be able to turn it off, but yeah, that's just me. And then in terms of connectivity, we have quite a few things here on the back. We have our expression port here for your expression pedal, volume pedal, things like that. Our guitar input here. We have a second input, which is a combo jack, so XLR and also jack. It also has phantom power on that should you need that, and we have a mic gain. So this is useful when doing profiles or captures. We have TRS or stereo effects loop, so you can add 2 TRS cables into here to have a stereo effects loop. We have TRS output, so balance output here. We have a phones jack just there, a MIDI in and out over here. We have our power jack, so you can use this to charge it up or leave it plugged in, along with a USB-C port, so you can use the editor. Now, if we go into the settings on the actual unit itself, we can see that we can change the brightness of the screen, for example, Or if we go down here, we have the bottom light section here. So I can change the brightness of the color underneath. I can change the color, for example. It can sync to the signal. I can make it so it slowly flashes or pulsates. And we can also go full on Mario Kart Rainbow Road mode with the rainbow mode. And we can select also which colors that it switches between. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of RGB kind of lighting all over the place, so I prefer to leave this on solid and then just one of these colors here. The unit also picks up, you know, fingerprints like a boss. So you'll definitely be using a duster on this and trying to keep it clean. So the way this works, or at least the connections, and it's super easy to set up, is we hit profiling over here, which is a separate button. We can only do this on the device itself. And then we get this menu, which is the sample option, or how we're going to sample or at least capture what we're going to be doing here. Now the thing here is that we have a few different options. We can capture a drive pedal, we can capture the preamp, the entire rig, or just the cab. I haven't done the cab one, but in the case of my setup here, so I've got a VHT Deliverance 60 that's running through a load box. I could go through, say, preamp, which usually involves the effects loop of the amp itself that's also hooked up to, say, a cab. But in my case, I'm going to go for entire, as well, we're running through the load box, so there is like a power amp coloration going on as well, which, you know, I think is a nice thing to have. And we'll do it this way to get the capture. So we've got everything hooked up here. So my guitar is going into the input as shown here. We have the load box output that's coming back in over here. We've got the FX loop send that's going to the front of the amp with this cable, and then our final two cables are going into our DAW or our interface to actually make the recording or hear what's going on. So then we hit next and we get to this screen over here. And so here we are on the sample page. We haven't done any sampling yet, but we can see that we already have signal that's coming into the unit. So now what we'll do is we'll start the capture process. I'll start a stopwatch just to have some idea how long it takes, and then we'll go from there. Now, one aspect to bear in mind, and this is the same case as with Tonex, is that when you're capturing just the amp through a load box and then going through the unit, there is no cab sim on there at all. So either you're going to be hearing the, the raw amp, which is quite harsh, or you best load some kind of IR loader within your DAW or interface so that at least you can hear the amp going through some kind of cab sim. What you can also do is if you've got a load box with, say, an IR loader or something like that, you can simply load it on that, and then you don't have to mess around, as I am, with an extra IR loader within the interface. All right, so the capture finished in about 3 minutes 45 around then. So similar, I guess, to some extent to the numbers that the Nano Cortex had in terms of capturing. The thing here that I have to note is that you don't have any, I guess, precise control over the input level outside of what you're doing on the load box itself or the output of the amp, if that makes sense. And there's no specific, I guess, range of input when doing the capture. So you have no idea of like the sweet spot. And I think the issue with this later on is that there'll be less consistency in terms of the quality of the captures. So if you're doing lots of captures and you have some way of looking at the sort of the input level, you could sort of gauge how much input that's coming back into the unit, but I can't really say what's the ideal input range coming back into this unit, which would make for potentially a better capture. So there's a bit of guesswork on that level. However, what we do have, which is really useful, is when we're comparing the target, so the amp, to the model that's within the unit, we can also adjust in a broad stroke sort of way the EQ, so like lows, mids, and highs, so we can get closer to what our target sounds like, and then switch between target and model accordingly to see how each one sounds until it's to our liking, and after that we can save. We can also adjust the amount of gain on our model that's going to be saved within the unit, as well as the volume or the output volume of the amp itself. So let's have a quick listen to how the target amp sounds and how the model sounds in here on the initial capture. So I guess there's a bit more volume in the real amp, maybe some gain and some minor EQ adjustments, so we'll do that now. So that's a lot closer already. I'll note that when you click on one of these, you can then use the select knob here to do fine adjustments as opposed to trying to use your finger to sort of set the knob value. So that makes things a lot easier. And then on the left here, we also have a capture button. So we can play through the different strings or the different notes, whatever, and go through different frequency ranges to get an even better or matched response of the capture. So we'll do that now. So that's after some tweaking. What I'm actually going to do is I'm not entirely sure how much, when you're doing this extra capture procedure, how much it's actually adding to the quality of the capture. And in my experience, I've actually had some really good results not redoing, not doing the capture procedure here. So hitting capture and then playing extra notes, as I felt that the initial capture was perhaps closer. So what I'd suggest is perhaps not going through this capture procedure as we just tried now, and then messing around with settings, and simply doing the initial capture and then messing around with the settings and not bothering with the extra capture. So here's the capture again, and I'm not going to touch the capture thing to refine the capture, and we'll see how close we can get just using the default kind of settings here. So I'm quite happy with that. So we can hit save now. And I've saved a few before, as you can see here. I've got a few loaded up. But we'll take an empty slot here and then we'll rename this to use in a preset. And one last thing for capturing drive pedals, it's super easy as well. So we'll hit drive in the sample option. And it's just a case of changing the connections. So the thing to note about this XLR jack here, I guess, is it's a combo XLR jack input. So you can also hook up a normal sort of instrument cable or patch cable into here. And to capture a drive pedal, it's super easy. You just hook it up like this, guitar in there. You do the FX output into your actual, well, distortion pedal or drive pedal, whatever. And then you come back in from that through this here. And then I'm going out to my monitoring interface over here. I did this just previously using, well, my Boss ST1 here. And I also did it with my OD808 as well. And the only thing here is that I tried with some other pedals as well, but the level of boost was simply too high. I'm not sure if this is an impedance issue or something else, but for example, I wanted to use my favorite boost, which is this Lush Audio Esahata boost. And no matter what I did on the pedal, the output level or the input level that was coming back in, it was simply too high and it couldn't take the level on that. Despite the fact that you do have a mic gain slot here, which is currently set to nothing, like there's no mic gain on there at all. So the thing is, I think it depends on the sort of stuff that you're actually trying to capture. And there might be certain things that might not work depending on either the output level, or it might be due to, say, impedance and things like that, that might mess around with what this unit is trying to see, and due to the input level, it can't actually capture. So this is the editor for the GS1000, and it's pretty straightforward. So we have our connection thing here, so we can connect it, disconnect it here. We have our editor portion here. Preset list over here. We can set the patch level, BPM, things like that, and a few other settings, which I'll get into in a bit. And then under the Manager tab, we have access to a few things, device update. So we can add or delete different IRs here if I want. I've already added some here. You can also do this within the editor page. I'll just note that. And then we have two other settings here. So we have the backup. So we can do a full backup of the unit, which is quite useful. And then we have this MNRS page, which is basically the capture or profiling files, I guess, or the format they use for the unit. And over here we have access to either the ones on the device, so we have a full overview of the drive samples or the captures that we've done, preamp captures that might be on there, entire sample, which means the amp through the cab, IR, things like that, and then just the cab, of which I have none at all. And we also have access here to the cloud, where we can access different captures that people have done themselves and put online with the same sort of categories. So either, say, drive captures that people have put online, preamp samples or preamp captures that people have put online, as well as entire sample and cab sample over here. So back to the editor here. Now I'll just open a new preset here so you have some idea what we're looking at. So these options up here, I'll just note that we have one option to set the volume pedal or how it works. And you can either set it to on or off, i.e. if you have an expression pedal that's set within the unit, you can then set it up there. And then we also have this tab here. So this basically sets up how we want the chain to be, or the signal chain. So either a normal series, which is like this, or we can also set up different ones. So a dual signal chain with using two inputs, a split, a mix, or a parallel. So it defaults to a serial signal chain, i.e. from input A to the output, it's going in one single line. However, what we can do is say set it to a split. So basically we have this split that we can set at any point during this chain here. And then after that, it will split to output A and output B, which can be useful for, say, using different effects on each side. Or for example, if you want to set up, so you have, say, a boost an overdrive here, and then you're going into 2 different amp chains along with their respective reverbs, delays, or whatever effects that you want to add to that. And then finally we have parallel here. So it's basically a parallel chain that's going alongside the main signal chain, which can be useful if, say, you want to set up some parallel effects. For my usage, I find the most useful has been the split. So you can run into 2 amps, for example, here, going to the 2 different outputs in stereo. Or otherwise, I've done a few patches just using the series or the usual setup, as it were, that you might be familiar with. Now, the thing here, on any of these blocks, you can add whatever effect that you want. So you could, for example, add loads of different amps like this, or you can add any combination of effects as long as you have enough CPU headroom. On this unit, when it maxes out at 100% or close to 100%, it will tell you if you can't add extra blocks. So either, the block will be grayed out. There won't be a message saying like DSP maxed out, but the block, if you're trying to add something, will either be grayed out, or I've had some cases where, I've added a block when there has been enough headroom per se, and it's disabled or deleted, say, a reverb block that was taking up too much DSP. So that way you won't have, say, the unit crashing if you're adding too many blocks that will max the CPU out. Now, there is something a bit particular about this unit, and that is, you might have noticed over here we have amp, power amp, and then cab. And that is because in every amp block, there is this separation between, say, a preamp, the entire chain, for example, here, which is basically the amp going through a cab, and then also your own captures, which might be a mix of, say, just the preamp or the entire signal, or, say, in my case, I've done some captures of the amp going through a load box. So in that case, I wouldn't need, say, a power amp simulation. And that's something you can add to taste, really, because maybe that's adding something that you like or dislike depending on the setup. However, if you're setting up, say, a more classic sort of chain, all these sort of classic amps, and it'll say it as well, they're preamps. So for example, if I go to, say, preamp section here, and I want to set up a matchless preset, I would add, say, the Matchbox 30 clean here, which says preamp. And then on the block after that, I go to power amp and select one of the power amps that I want to use with this. In this case, I'll use the Dr. 3 EL84. And what's quite handy is it always says what it's based on. It's not the matchless power section. However, out of the ones I've tried, this one works quite well along with that. And then finally, you'll add a cab along to that over here. And then you can select between, say, under classic, and these are the ones that have typically been, I believe, in a lot of the Mooer units up till now. And then under boutique, we have various IRs that Chop Tones have added here, and also some other ones from Mooer. I'll be adding the Matchbox here, and we'll see how this sounds like. It's all right, but we can definitely add sort of source here to make it sound better. And a few things we can do is, for example, add some presence on the power amp module. We can add some treble brightness here, maybe a bit more gain to get some breakup here. And we'll also add, say, a reverb here at the end. I'll go for, say, a room reverb, and it's in stereo. We'll up the mix a bit. Maybe a bit of pre-delay, and I'll add a boost up front just to add some character, and I'll go for the blues crab here. I'll turn the gain down a bit and add a bit of volume and see where we get. Obviously, there's other effects that we can add here in different sections. So let's say there's dynamic effects here with different compressors, noise gates, and things like that. A filter section with, say, wah pedals, filter blocks, Q filters, Qtron style stuff, overdrive along with that. And then at the end, we have, say, EQs that we want to add, a whole bunch of different modulation, delay of different types, and then reverbs. Now you might have noticed here that there's different reverbs. There's classic and then V2. V2 are updated algorithms that I think sound pretty good, and they also use up more CPU. So that's something to bear in mind when you're putting things together. And then we also have an effects loop block that we can set however we want within the actual signal chain, and then connect additional pedals to the unit via the effects loop send and return. Now the cool thing about having such a sort of flexible signal chain, by that I mean in this case every single block you can assign to whatever you want to, bearing in mind CPU limits, is that you can come up with some pretty cool sounds or experimental style stuff, ambient and things like that, that works really well with this unit. Now, a quick explanation of what's going on in this preset that I set up, which I've aptly named Swell Pad. I'm actually not using an amp block. I just put in a power amp here to add a bit of character, I guess, to the actual, well, the sound of the guitar that's going into these other effects, but I think I could probably just delete this, to be honest. And I'm using a compressor to keep the level of the guitar and I'm using the compressor, in this case, a deluxe comp, to keep the level of the guitar nice and strong, but not clipping, if that makes sense. So because I'm using no amp and no cab, I have this really full range style guitar signal. And that's going into all these other effects to create those pad sounds. So I'm using an octave effect to just add a lower octave and then some dry signal, and there's a bit of upper octave as well. A slow gear here, which is an auto volume swell, and then a shimmer reverb, which is on pretty much max decay, full mix. Studio delay, just to add a bit more kind of almost reverberation or a bit more length to the notes. A cathedral reverb that's almost on max decay as well. And then to add a bit of drama, I've got a tremolo going on at the end, which is giving that kind of pulsating effect. Now, the cool thing about the IR block is that we have a few of these options in here which can be quite useful. For example, the sample rate or the sample length of the IR, which can make a difference. And we have this early reflection tab, which means I think it's like adding some very slight delay so that you have a bit more give, I guess. I think that's what they're trying to get at when using, say, IRs or even different cabs and things like that. So that can be quite an interesting addition to have, depending on the sort of tones that you might be going for. Typically, I'm used to pretty direct sounds, so this is not necessarily something I would use when you've got a reverb or things like that going on, but it's a nice option to have. And this is where you've also got the low cut and the high cut, and it's in frequency as well. So you can really dial in the sort of low cut or high cut that you want. So in this preset, I was using the Matchbox 3112 IR, which comes stock with the unit, but you can get a lot more out of the unit, I think, when you're using your own or third-party IRs. Now the preset itself is pretty simple. Just added a noise gate here, which is the noise killer, which is basically a very hard closing noise gate, which is very useful, kind of heavier tone. Then I've got the pure boost, which is one of the factory boosts that you have in the unit, the VHT profile or the capture that I made of the amp, and then an ML SoundLab Damon 60 IR, which I typically use for high gain tones. I've added a multi-tap delay at the end and a stereo reverb. And I'll just note I'm at 78% CPU usage, so there's still some headroom to add different effects should I want to do that. Now, one of the really cool things about this unit is that you can also capture drive pedals, and within the overdrive section we have this GNR portion. So there's already a few that I've loaded in here. Some are from the Cloud, so the Boss HM2, the full tone OCD, the Devil, which is the Taylor Danley pedal. He also made a really good review of this unit. And then I made two of my own, which is one of the SD1, the Boss, and then the OD808. So you can also load these as well. However, bear in mind that they do use more CPU. To give an idea, I'm at 79% at the moment on the unit. However, if I load the OD808, which is a profile, I shoot up to around the 90% mark. So there's 10, 11% that is used on, let's say, the profile of a drive unit. So I'll compare here the profile I made of my OD808 with typical settings, level max, drive on 0, tone at 50%, alongside the 808 that's within the Mooer unit. Now for me at least, I kind of prefer the profiled pedal in this case compared to the one that's within the unit. It's a similar vibe, but there's just something extra to the profiled version, or at least the profile I made myself. And I've still got that flexibility with gain, tone and volume if I want to use that. But typically I just maybe use the volume to add a bit more boost into either an amp or in this case the profile of the amp that I made. So in terms of CPU, just to give some idea, depending on how you've set things up, you can also save CPU this way. So instead of having, say, a separate amp profile and then the IR that you're loading separately, if you bake this into the actual sample, you can save CPU here. I'll just give an example here. So if I'm just using the whole sample or a whole rig that's been sampled, it's around, I think 22%, 23% I'm seeing on the CPU. If I load things as I had before, I'm at 45 or so percent. So if you're using the IR block here, and depending also on the sample rate or sample length that you're using, it will use more or less CPU. And with that in mind, I'll set up another preset which is going to be using two profiles in a stereo setup. So I'm going out to two different amps that are set in stereo. So for this, I'll take an empty preset, and then first things first, we'll set it to be a split signal chain. We'll set our split to be after the noise gate and a boost. So we'll add a noise gate right at the start, so the noise killer. For our second block, we'll add, say, the profile of the OD808 that we had. And now the split happens here. And now to get that kind of wider stereo sound of 2 amps on each side, we can hit output A, and then we set it to be all the way to the left. Let's get this all the way to the left. You can use this to go down. And then on output B, we'll set it to be all the way to the right. And now we can add our amps and effects should we want going out to each one. So on output A, which is going all the way to the left, we'll use the profile that I made of my VHT. That's right there. We'll do the same thing over here. And then we just have to add cab IRs to each one. So let's say the cab on this side, we'll go for the Damon 60 57C. On the other side, just for a slight difference, we'll go for the B cab. And so with this setup, with 1024 sample rate on both of the IRs, and we've got the profile of the distortion, and then our 2 amp profiles, one on either side. We're at 80%, so we still have some room to add, say, a delay and maybe a reverb. So we'll see if I can do that. So I'll add a delay here, let's say simple digital delay on each side. We're at 87%, and then I'll see if there's room for a reverb. No, there's no room for a reverb, unfortunately. So they're grayed out, but we have at least 2 different delays on there, which typically for heavier tones, depending on the sort of thing you're doing, can be enough. Now the only thing here is when we're adding effects or stereo effects, when we're basically going out dual mono, if this makes sense. So basically on each side, it's not a stereo, it's not going out to stereo on the left and going out to stereo on the right. By stereo, I mean there's 2 outputs that are on the left and the right. So an important thing to note is to set any effects when you're doing this to mono. So we'll do that here. And what this means is that we can open things up to set a different sort of subdivision of the delay on one side and then the other. So typically I'd put, say, a quarter note on one side and then a dotted eighth on the other. Now here we set the tempo sync to on, so quarter note on the left side, and then on the right side we'll set it to dotted eighth. Let's just up the mix a bit, and yeah, the feedback as well on both. I'll have a playthrough with and without these effects for some lead stuff. So yeah, by doing that, you can get a really wide kind of fat metal sound, not unlike the sort of thing that I would use myself using my FM3. So I'll just save this in case, but something I did as well was to capture my FM3 tone as well, which is something similar, I guess, with a different amp also going through the ML SoundLab Damon 60 IR. Now the thing here is that on, say, this patch where there's 2 captures of my kind of main preset that I've been using for quite a while on the FM3, because they're entire sample captures, so the amp, the cab and everything else, it uses a lot less CPU. So for example, on this preset, I've got 62% CPU usage, so there is still room, for example, for me to add, if I wanted to, I could add a reverb, a room reverb on both of these outputs and still have, well, I'm at 85% on this setup. So it does open things up if you have different ways or you have different captures that you want to use. Now, one thing I didn't test was, say, the difference between a capture with the boost built in or a capture of, say, the boost pedal separately along with the amp. But I think there'd be similarities between the two. It's just nice to have that kind of flexibility in that you've got profiled distortion, overdrive, or boosts that you use in front of any kind of amp, preamp, or setup that you've got within the unit. So there you go. There's the unit. You know, this is quite a long video. I thought I'd finish up with sort of pros and cons with the unit, and also things that I'd like to see improved. So in terms of pros, I mean, the size of this, it's really portable, and of course, it being battery powered, it can last quite a long time, sort of like 5 or 6 hours, and you can take this anywhere with you basically. So that's really cool. The ease of use, the editors, it's quite logical, the touchscreen as well. The open signal path is really cool, so I think the fact that you can load any block at any point in the signal chain, there's no limitations there, I think that's really good. The fact that you can also capture and load drive pedals and have enough CPU headroom as well to sort of load a profiled overdrive along with an amp, for example, I think that's really well done. And in terms of cons, and there are a few here for me, is that I really found that the profiles or the captures were generally quite a lot better than, say, the stock amp models. So that's something to bear in mind. If you buy something like this and you're relying completely on either external captures, and I'll tie into my next point here, there isn't a large community just yet, or at least in what I've seen out there, for lots of different captures and things like that that you can add onto the unit, which is unlike, say, if you look at Tonex or Kemper, or even Neural DSP with the Cortex Cloud. There's loads of stuff out there which you can add to the unit, and for this it's not quite there yet. You know, there's certain stuff that's on the cloud within the editor already, which is cool, and I'll really need to sort of dig a bit deeper to find some more on Google, to find sort of more captures that you can use with the device. But that's something to bear in mind as well when looking at something like this. However, if you do have access to like cool amps, effects, and things like that, this is a really easy way to actually capture stuff, as the process is really short, and you know, I think it does a pretty good job at that. The same thing goes, I think, for the cabs that are within the unit. I found that you know, third-party IRs, you know, not all of them, but I generally find that third-party IRs did a lot better than the ones that were stock on the unit. And then also, I think the effects are a bit kind of hit or miss. They're all certainly usable, and there's some ones that are better than others, but I think there is certainly room for improvement in that part. So for me, things I'd love to see with this unit is sort of like certain quality of life features. So having a CPU bar within the editor would be a cool kind of touch. And then have improved effects at some point in a future update. So more V2 effects that would be added to the unit would be really cool. And then also have proper levels or calibration for the actual profiling or the capturing side of things. So as you saw, when you go to the capturing part, you do see the sort of levels, but there's no real indication of what's, you know, the ideal. You know, there's so much variation that's possible there. So that can also mean that later on, when basically looking at captures that you might have gotten off the internet or different captures, there might be a huge variation there as well. And if you look at, say, Tonex or even you know, Nano Cortex, Neural DSP stuff, there is sort of recommendations there of, you know, levels that you should aim for to get into that sweet spot to get a good capture. And it'd be great to see something similar on the GS1000 as well. So all in all, a promising unit. You know, it has a lot of potential as long as it gets the support around it as well. And by that I mean that it has, say, a good community around it that's, you know, sharing or uploading captures that they've taken, that the cloud is constantly maybe updated with maybe more captures that come from Mooer themselves, you know, a bit like how IK Multimedia does with Tonex or even Neural DSP, where they've added captures they've done themselves so that you can use those as well. And those are certainly things that will help push this unit along, especially with quite a lot of competition in that kind of price point, where you've got, say, Nano Cortex now with the latest update that has extra effects drives and things like that that you can set up around the capture that you've done. And also Tonex adding effects fairly recently in updates so that you can add further effects using the unit itself, even on the Tonex one, which retails around 170, 180 euros, I think. However, the thing that this still has over all these units, and as silly as it sounds, is that I just love the fact that it's battery powered and that, you can take it anywhere. It's super portable and just use it basically anywhere. In any case, hope you got something out of that. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.